Hey everybody, welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, Assistant Professor of Communication and Media at Lund University. Remember, you can follow the show on Twitter at SMNP Podcast or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. So we're about 1 week away from the 2020 U.S. elections, so I thought we'd keep a American politics focus for this episode. And my guest today is Dr. Terry Towner. She is a professor in political science at Oakland University and co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Information Technology and Politics. And as we record this, we just had the second presidential debate, even though I say third in the interview. And so we'll talk about some initial impressions from that debate and also some work that Professor Towner has done around polling in key Midwestern states such as Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania since the beginning of the year. So we'll get some interesting takes on how citizens in these states have been getting their political information from social media and mainstream media. And we'll also dive into Professor Towner's work around campaigning and political information on Instagram. So we're going to go over two studies. One is called The Image is the Message, Instagram Marketing in the 2016 Presidential Primary Season. That study is in the Journal of Political Marketing. And we'll also talk about a more recent study called Instagramming Issues, Agenda Setting During the 2016 Presidential Campaign. That's published in Social Media and Society. Links to both of those studies will be in the show notes. But without further ado, let me turn it over to Professor Towner. Again, she's a professor in political science at Oakland University. Professor Towner, thanks for taking the time out and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Thanks for having me today.
So before we dive into your research on Instagram, we have the U.S. election coming up and just had the third presidential debate between Biden and Trump. What are your initial impressions coming out of that debate?
Well, this was the second debate, right?
True.
Right? Because we did not have the second debate because President Trump, they were concerned about his health at the time since he tested positive for COVID. So this was our only second test of how Biden and Trump would do on the debate stage. And I would say that this was a much more of a debate last night. President Trump was much more reserved. His temperament was more calm. And I think that, his advisors told him that, this anger and this interruption, it's not good. This is not what we should be doing in civil discourse. So it was nice to see some debate on some of the substantive issues. I heard more about where the candidates stood on healthcare, immigration, and climate change last night. So I was very pleased to see that we had a little bit more of a civil debate last night, which is good for all of our voters out there, especially those who are still unsure on how they're going to vote on Election Day.
Yeah, and I only watched the first half because it was last night as we record this, and I watched it in the morning, but I'm curious to get your thoughts to see if you agree, because I'm always interested more in the strategy than the actual kind of content that they're saying. Mm-hmm. And I thought President Trump in his first answer on coronavirus came out very well, and it seemed like he had it kind of rehearsed, and he was actually sticking to his script. But what I thought was really interesting was on the first sort of turn of talk, when Biden was talking, Trump was taking notes, or he looked like he was taking notes. He was scribbling away furiously, and then he gave that up very quick. So I was wondering if he was trying to be, more looking like a normal candidate who scribbles down notes trying to catch that soundbite.
I think that this is what he was advised to do last night. I think his advisors encouraged him to make this more of a debate that Americans would expect. The first debate was highly criticized by experts, pundits, media, scholars, because we really didn't see a civil discussion on the issues. And so at least last night, we started out talking about coronavirus. What's your plan? How are you going to proceed with this pandemic? Which I think is on the top minds of Americans right now, the COVID crisis as well as the economy. And we saw both President Trump and Joe Biden had to lay out their plan. And Trump talked about how there's going to be a vaccine available within weeks or by the end of the year, and Biden talking about, he was pressed on, would you have, shut the country back down? How are you going to end this virus? So at least we saw a more substantive discussion and a plan. I think Americans want a plan. They want to see, what are you going to do? How are you going to approach this problem? So we saw that a little bit more last night. I think the mics may have been turned off once or twice on some of the responses, but not too much. I think both of the candidates really held back on the interruption and the continuing, but they wanted to get certain points out, many of which probably were rehearsed, but that's what you do in a debate, right? You prepare, you want to get certain points out to voters, particularly those who still have not made up their minds.
Yeah, and I think listening to advisors is an interesting point, because the other thing that jumped out at me from the debate was when Trump criticized Biden for having a sort of standard political line when he was talking about families sitting at the kitchen table, which is basically what Chris Christie did to Marco Rubio in the last presidential election, where Rubio went into quote unquote Rubio bot mode, where he kept repeating the same line and Christie kept saying, look, this is the rehearsed politician. And I think Chris Christie was advising Trump on these debates. So I think he actually took some of that advice and tried to play it out, but didn't land it as well as Christie did.
I heard Joe Biden repeat several main lines last night. He had several one-liners that, both candidates want to get in one-liners so the media can pick up. I know Joe Biden, he repeated his points on family, and he also repeated his points on, we're not just red and blue states. I don't know if you picked this up, but he said this at least 2 or 3 times and spent a significant amount of time talking about how we're not just red and blue, we are Americans. And I'm not going to treat states differently. I mean, he said that point 2 or 3 times, and which was rehearsed, but it was something that was picked up by the media quite a bit today. And the same point about family as well, reverting to his family background, and he knows that resonates with the American people.
Definitely. And I'm going to ask you about some polls you've been working on in a second, but do you think it's really changed anyone's mind, this debate, or are pretty much people settled in their opinions?
Okay, I knew you were going to ask me this, because I feel like a lot of us have already made up our minds on the top of the ticket. I mean, many Americans are already voting. They're early voting. They've turned in their absentee ballot. I'll admit to you right now, I voted already 3 weeks ago and mailed in my ballot. And so I really don't think we're going to see any movement. I saw several of the focus group results this morning, and I think maybe it was a 1 percentage point, move on favorability or unfavorability. And we've always seen in the research that debates just don't have a significant influence on how we're going to vote on election day.
But they are fun to watch.
They are absolutely fun to watch.
So let's turn over to some of the work you've been doing in polling with the Baldwin-Wallace University Great Lakes poll, which studies voter sentiment about the election in Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And I think it's an interesting poll because all of these states are more or less swing states. At least Real Clear Politics lists each one as a toss-up. So what do you think makes these states so competitive?
Okay, I love this project. This is a collaborative project that I'm doing with Baldwin-Wallace, as well as Ohio Northern with Dr. Lauren Copeland and Dr. Robert Alexander. And I am so excited about this project. This has been something that we've been working on since January. We fielded about 4 or 5 polls on the election in the beginning. And then, of course, the pandemic occurred. And so we immediately had to revert to asking about, how voters felt about COVID. And the purpose of this poll is really because looking at 2016, we saw how competitive these states were. I mean, in Michigan, Trump won Michigan by less than 1%. It was fewer than 11,000 votes out of nearly 4.8 million cast and counted. And Ohio was not the only state that took a partisan turn. Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, they all voted for Barack Obama in 2012. And then voted for Trump in 2016. And in some cases, the gap was not by very much. So the question here is, are these states, particularly Ohio, Michigan, are these battleground states? Are these swing states? What's going on here? And do Democrats have a chance of flipping these states back to the Democratic column in 2020? So focusing on, what makes these states so competitive. And I'm going to look at Michigan, my home state, looking at Michigan's voting history. I mean, this 20-year stretch of Democratic wins, but then we have this revitalism of conservatism in Detroit suburbs. And this is really due to demographic shifts that we've seen in 2012 to 2016. Numerous regions just became more Republican in 2016. Kind of the middle of the state, in the thumb area would be above Detroit. They flipped red. And this kind of new understanding came to light to those of us who were, studying public opinion in these states, particularly Michigan, is this white working class in Michigan had kind of abandoned Democrats. The union leadership was really weak or non-existent. And union members, they started moving to the Republican Party, which who would have predicted this? And we also saw that young people weren't overly mobilized in 2016. They wanted to vote for someone, like Barack Obama, which just wasn't on the ballot in 2016. But then going back to this competitiveness, so we see this kind of, rise of conservatism in 2016, right? And Trump wins by less than 1%. But then in 2018, blue wave, a Democratic governor, Senate, Attorney General, 2 flipped House seats. I mean, all the way down to state Supreme Court seats, even state university boards. Michigan legalizes recreational pot. We now made voting easier in the state of Michigan. So in 2018, we see this blue wave. So everyone's thinking, okay, is Michigan a swing state or is this just a battleground state? Will we see Michigan go back to blue in 2020, which is kind of what the Great Lakes poll is actually showing if you've taken a peek at our recent results.
Yeah, definitely. And of course, I was interested in the questions you were asking about citizens' social media habits, because you had a couple questions about that and the poll, also around the coronavirus and if people are spending more time online because of that. So what type of questions have you been asking sort of broadly, and what jumped out at you as interesting or surprising?
Well, social media is definitely my wheelhouse. This is something I've been studying since 2008. And so I really encouraged the collaborative team at Baldwin Wallace that, we want to ask media questions, but I want to also ask about, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and how they're being used for the campaign. So one of the questions we asked was, how often are you following these outlets to get information about the presidential campaign? And we asked about social media as well as mainstream media. And I was very surprised that a majority of the respondents reported using television for presidential news more so than social media platforms. And I'm thinking, what? Social media has been on the rise. This is what we use for entertainment and information. And so the way we interpreted this is the COVID crisis just significantly changed this picture. Television news has just had an uplift in viewership, particularly local television news. I mean, social media, it's a great thing. It opens us up, right? But we really saw in this poll that a lot of people wanted to go to a platform that they trusted more. One of the results from the questions we asked was about trust in your news and trust in outlets that you focused on. And we really saw a split in the news and information on trust. Trust in social media was just simply lower. And one of the questions we asked was about how concerned are you about the increase in, foreign powers, perhaps manipulating our elections or giving us misinformation. And we saw more than 60% of respondents were concerned about this. And they're concerned about social media being interfered with and manipulated. So we're reverting back more to television news, newspapers, and perhaps that great podcast that may be out there, right?
That's interesting. This point about local news, I hadn't thought about that because, in a sense, social media is, as you said, it opens us up, and particularly platforms like Twitter, to the national conversation or international trends. But in a sense, maybe it's more difficult to seek out local news on social media platforms because, at least with TV, you know exactly where to go to find that local news station.
Exactly. I think citizens, we want balanced, accurate, and unbiased information. I think we are desperate to find a neutral outlet for credible and reliable information. And I think this is why we see kind of more of this shift to our local news outlets, our local TV, perhaps our local paper. And many are more willing to, hey, I'm going to pay $1 a month because I want to read a paper that's, the Washington Post and New York Times. I'm willing to pay for a subscription for reliable news. And we saw in this poll that several people, actually majority of citizens, said, we want social media platforms to flag or delete, remove false or misleading information. It was overwhelming, the amount that said, please remove this. We want reliable, credible news. We're concerned about what is true or false on the internet. So I really do think there is a deep desire out there for credible, balanced, reliable news.
Definitely. And I want to come back to that sort of comparison between TV and social media towards the end. But let's switch gears here a bit and talk about your research on Instagram. And first, I'd like to go back to the 2016 election primaries, where you studied how presidential candidates were using Instagram for campaigning. And first off, what piqued your interest to study Instagram in the first place?
I love this work that we've been doing on Instagram. Of course, I'm an Instagram user myself. So studying it, trying to learn what its role is in politics has been really fascinating. So Dr. Munoz and I felt that, first off, no one was really studying Instagram's role in campaigning in politics coming into 2016. There's just very few studies on this visual platform. Yeah, I've done some research with YouTube, and there's some research out there on Tumblr and Pinterest, but there's just not a lot on Instagram and Snapchat, for that matter. So we felt that this was extremely odd because Instagram was a booming and extremely popular social media platform. I believe in December 2016, Instagram had reached record-breaking numbers in users. I think it was over 600 million users. And it was a user base that was just double the size of Twitter. Another reason we really wanted to study Instagram is because it was image and visually geared. We really felt that people were moving away from communicating with just text, and we were shifting more to visuals. I mean, honestly, who hasn't communicated with a friend or a family member or a spouse with just a string of Bitmojis or a string of images? So this is what we were interested in, this visual platform. How is this impacting the campaign arena? And we just kind of felt that visuals, were the future of political communication. So we wanted to jump on that quickly. And we just felt that, people remember visuals and images so much more. They get our attention. We respond to them, usually in emotional ways. So we thought, wow, Instagram is giving candidates and campaigns this ability to choose how to present themselves visually to a potential voter. And we were just fascinated by that. So we wanted to know how candidates were doing that on Instagram, if at all. What lighting are you using? What filter are you smiling? Are you posing? All of these things we are interested in, how visually presenting themselves to us.
Yeah, it's really interesting, especially with the filters. I can ask you about that in a second. But, when you're looking at a platform that hasn't really been studied before, you have any sort of range of options to pick on how to approach it. And the angle that you took to analyze the politician's self-presentation was the ideal candidate frame versus the populist frame. And so can you describe kind of what these frames would look like in practice?
Well, we applied Grabe and Busey's work on visual framing analysis of television coverage, of earlier campaigns, kind of the 90s through 2004 presidential campaigns. And we wanted to figure out what kind of master character frames were found, in some of these images, very similar to newscasts. So we looked at first at the ideal candidate theme, which is the statesmanship and compassion presentation. So statesmanship was how you visually communicating images of power, control, and active leadership, and we were looking at images of elected officials, and did they include an influential? Did they include a patriotic symbol such as the American flag? Did they have symbols of progress? Did they have an entourage with them or behind them? All those types of things that you can put in an image, such as campaign paraphernalia. I mean, some candidates were simply in front of a wall just full of yard signs, with their name on it. What kind of attire did they have on? Were they formal? Were they informal? And of course, the compassion frame was looking at warmth and kindness. Was the politician holding a baby and handing out lollipops? Were there family associations? A lot of candidates post, vintage images of when they were kids, or religious symbols. Also, lots of gestures. The thumbs up. President Trump loves to do that gesture, interacting with voters, kind of all that compassion element. And then that populist theme builds on that idea that ordinary people, hey, we stand in opposition to an aristocratic and self-asserting lead. This is communicated through, mass appeal, and I'm ordinary, right? So drawing on this understanding that I'm with a celebrity, I'm in a large audience, I'm in a big group of crowds, I'm popular. And then, of course, the ordinary idea is, hey, I'm just the average Joe. I'm in the casual dress. I'm working out. There are a couple, I believe Bernie Sanders loved to post pictures of himself playing basketball and interacting with ordinary people. This was all just saying, hey, I'm just a regular citizen seeking higher office. And so these were some of the frames that we were looking for in the Instagram images from candidates.
Yeah, and I'm cutting a bit through a lot of the methods here because I want to get to one of your other studies as well. But overall, which frames did candidates use the most, and what seemed to be most effective?
Well, when we were looking at 2016, of course, President Trump or candidate Trump at that time, was the most frequent user. He was, using Instagram quite a bit, and this was followed by Hillary Clinton. And one of the things that we found is that the presidential candidates relied very heavily on that ideal candidate master frame. They wanted to present themselves as that ideal candidate, with patriotic symbols, so many American flags, behind candidates. Clinton walking with President Obama, waving to a crowd, and Rubio and Trump at a Republican debate, and Kasich speaking with this large waving American flag, filling the background. Trump posing with 4 police officers. And then, of course, some of those historical photos of Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton in front of the White House. Those were often used in her campaign. And that is presenting to us that I am the ideal candidate for you. Select me on your ballot. I mean, and those things, those images resonate with people who are scrolling through that Instagram feed.
Yeah, I guess it gets to this idea of electability, which has been such a huge buzzword this election cycle. I guess if you want to be looked at as electable, it's better to present yourself as the ideal candidate versus the populist.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So I hadn't planned to ask you about this, but it is an interesting part of the study, I think, which is about the use of filters. You're even able to see which filters the candidates used, if they did at all. So what was the kind of finding there about filters, which we all use in our Instagram posts, but maybe the candidates not so much?
Well, we wanted to look at filters because we wanted to know, first of all, if they were used. And overall, what we found is most of the Instagram posts, they didn't use a filter. And one of the things I would have to say as someone who's studied Instagram for a while is that candidates are just not as savvy with Instagram as one would expect. They are not using stories. A lot of them are not using videos yet. They're not using the full functions that Instagram has available. And so we were a little surprised that a lot of candidates didn't use the filter, but it makes sense because they just haven't figured out all of the really cool features that Instagram has to offer. They're probably not regular users of Instagram. But I believe the number one we found was the Clarendon was the most popular filter of the candidates, followed by, I think, Lark. But overall, they're not using the filters yet, which I really think they should. There are so many fun features on Instagram that I would love to see our candidates using. It would certainly make it more fun.
Yeah, I'm thinking also maybe for certain candidates, particularly the ones that do the populist frame, that maybe the filter maybe works against that sometimes. I'm thinking about Scott Walker, who we talked about last election cycle, how he would just post a picture of like a half-eaten ham sandwich, or his T-shirt or jersey before he goes to the game. Maybe in some cases the filter might work against you in that scenario.
Yeah, carefully select your filters here and make sure your filter is on at the appropriate times. That's also important.
Definitely. And so 2016 was really the first election where Instagram was adopted by presidential candidates. But even though it was popular back then, it's really exploded since 2016. So do you think that Instagram's relevance has increased for candidates this election cycle?
I really do. And I want to point to examples such as, Beto O'Rourke, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Stacey Abrams. They showed us that Instagram can be a game changer in campaigning. And it's really time to jump on that Instagram bandwagon. And this is critical because you want to win support from the social media savvy millennials and Gen Zs right now in this 2020 campaign. That's where these voters exist. They're on Instagram, and potential voters, are using it. I mean, the user base on Instagram has doubled in the past 2 years. And yes, Twitter is still a very popular platform for politicians as well as our president. But there's a real trend in Instagram adoption. You cannot ignore it. And we've seen during the pandemic, your only option if you were a candidate vying for office was digital or social media platforms. I mean, many had to shun formal press briefings, knocking on door, campaign events. You had to turn to Facebook, Instagram. A lot of them use video. It's very popular on Instagram, and candidates have been using it very effectively. But one of the main reasons, if you were a candidate, to use this and why it should be relevant to you right now is you want to engage with that younger, more dynamic audience that maybe you can't reach on TV or radio. So it's a very important platform for candidates to be using right now.
Definitely. And, when we talk about studying social media, there's kind of the literature focusing on candidates campaigning. And then there's also a large chunk of studies looking at information that people are getting from these platforms. And so I want to turn over to one of your studies just published in Social Media and Society that looked at the relationship between political news discussed on Instagram and then also in mainstream news. And there you sought to examine what's called intermediate agenda setting effects between political Instagram posts and mainstream news articles. So to understand that study, I think we first need to understand agenda setting. So can you outline what agenda setting theory is and how social media factors into that mix?
So we really wanted to examine if Instagram was becoming a main player in this, hybrid media system that we are enjoying right now. And so we sought to examine intermediate agenda setting in particular. And one's political agenda, that's their political priority list. So in the case of media, agenda setting is, that power of the media or Instagram to impact what topics are important. What's at the top of the public agenda or the political agenda. What does the newspaper headline say above the fold? What topic is the leading headline story in the nightly news? So media coverage, it's telling us what to think about, and it's determining how much we learn, how much importance do we want to place on that issue. And we know very well that the media and the press, they filter and shape and frame reality rather than mirror it. And we also know that when the media focuses on just a few of the top issues or a subject, the public, we're going to perceive those issues as more important. So now that we're in this phase or this era of advances in technology and this rise in social media platforms, we know that mainstream journalists, they're drawing from bloggers, podcasters. And then the bloggers and podcasters, they're drawing from the mainstream press. So this is this intermedia agenda setting relationship, or this kind of symbiotic relationship between this digital press and the mainstream press.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question to explore, because I was thinking about Instagram, and it doesn't really have this type of public discussion space like Twitter does, or like Facebook has through its various groups. I mean, there's the explore feature, but it's not much, as you were saying, very visual and not so much text-based. So how did you actually go about studying the political issues that citizens were talking about on Instagram?
So we knew that this would be complicated because it is more of a visual platform, and you can really only do hashtags, and links are limited. And of course, this is an ever-changing platform too, which makes it even more difficult to study. So in this research, we specifically examined posts about the Republican, Democrat, and independent candidates, and this was in the 2016 primary. And we used Beautify, which is a third-party company that kind of crawled all of the Instagram posts for us. And they searched and collected posts with a whole list of hashtags and tags that were relevant to the campaign at the time. And then we also looked at the mainstream papers, New York Times, the Post, the USA Today, the LA Times, because we wanted to examine, this relationship between the two. Is Instagram and mainstream press, are they mentioning and talking about the same topics? So we did a content analysis of both of these mediums. We had a comprehensive list of about, I think, 33 main issues. And we also selected issues that were unique to 2016, such as, Black Lives Matter, climate change, because we really wanted to narrow down, if these two platforms were talking about similar topics or not. So we coded everything. It was the Instagram captions, the hashtags, and the tags for any issue frequencies. And then we did the same with the mainstream press. We went through and content analyzed everything, looking for mentions of these issues to see if we could find a relationship or any type of correlation between the two media platforms.
And so between comparing the two, did you find evidence for this intermedia agenda setting effect?
Well, the crossover relationships were very minimal. So we just didn't see a lot of evidence for that agenda setting or intermedia agenda setting relationship in this period. And I think out of the top 10 issues that we tested, only about 6 contain, that significant cross correlation. And I think it was immigration, civil rights, military, abortion, health, and banking. I mean, we just really found that Instagram users, they were talking much more about civil rights, and we saw that newspapers were talking more about the economy and banking. So we didn't see a whole lot. And I think this can be attributed to the fact that we have very different users who are reading mainstream papers versus those who are using Instagram. But we did find some relationship. And I'm really curious if we redid this study in 2020, if we would actually see a stronger link now that Instagram has increased in usage and has become more of a force in the 2020 campaign. So I'm wondering if I have time to repeat this study in 2020 and see if there are any differences in the findings.
Yeah. And also, I think because as any, there's this pattern where younger people tend to keep moving to different platforms, right? It's now Instagram to TikTok or Twitch.
Right.
Maybe there are older people who read papers that are now on Instagram and posting about politics.
Hey, older people could be looking at Instagram for pictures of their grandkids and may come across, some political information. I mean, one never knows.
Right. And you end the article by stating that television might give more insight into this intermedia agenda setting with Instagram, because you were looking at newspapers, which, obviously for content analysis reasons. And I'd like to tie that into one of the findings from the Great Lakes poll, which we were talking about earlier, which is that people seem to be getting more political information from TV than social media. So wrapping up here, I'd like to ask about your thoughts on social media in relation to television, which still seems to be such a dominant force in US politics, even though there's so much focus on social media. So would you agree that television still is the dominant communication technology in US politics? And if so, what does that mean for candidates' adoptions of newer technologies like Instagram?
Television is still king right now. And I think, if I was going to redo this study in 2020, television would probably be the comparison. I would want to see if there was a intermedia agenda setting relationship between what we're discussing in television news to Instagram. And of course, that makes sense because television is a visual medium. And so I think it's logical for a future study to look at television news, comparing it to Instagram or Snapchat or other social media platforms. But as I noted to you earlier, due to COVID, candidates really had to use digital and social media platforms more. And these are mediums, Facebook Live and Instagram videos that are that's how they can reach us directly. I mean, candidates use social media in order to get to us without the filter of the mainstream. And so these platforms, Instagram, Snapchat, Twitch, TikTok, they're going to continue to play a very important role in directly reaching voters, specifically in how they narrow target certain voters. But as we discussed and as we saw in the Great Lakes poll, the COVID crisis has substantially increased news consumption from mainstream media, and television news has just seen significant increases. More people identify television as their main source. And I think it's a result of the COVID crisis. I also think that social media is getting a bad rap because of the spreading of false info and not regulating this information. And so this is kind of why we see a rise in other social media platforms, such as Instagram, which is owned by Facebook, and newer platforms. We know Snapchat has become super popular with younger groups. Celebrities and influencers, they've played a very outsized role in these networks, sharing music, exercise videos. If I was a campaign consultant, I would say, look, people are not going to stop using social media and messaging apps. I mean, we haven't even talked about WhatsApp. They use these platforms for entertainment, to connect with family and friends, archives for pictures. But our media habits have changed during COVID. Most people have turned during the live broadcast television news. They say they trust it more. But so if you're running for office right now or in the future, you just can't campaign on one platform. You have to use it all, and you have to use it all well, which I think is important. You have to use TV. You have to use Facebook. You have to have Instagram stories. You have to have ads on video games like Barack Obama did in 2008 and 2012. You have to use local television. And hey, let's not forget radio and podcasts, right? You have to use it all, and you have to be savvy in using it. And television is still going to be an important medium for quite some time. And you can't just not have television ads. I mean, those are important, but you also have to adopt those newer technologies, as they rise up. Joe Biden, get a Snapchat filter. These are things you have to have as part of your campaign.
Yeah, it's super complex thinking about all the things candidates have to do. But I hadn't thought about this relationship between COVID and TV and what that means for social media research. That's super interesting.
Yes.
But Professor Towner, thanks so much for taking the time out and sharing your insights with us.
Thank you for having me. This was a great conversation.
I've just been speaking with Dr. Terry Towner, Professor of Political Science at Oakland University. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Coming up, we'll be diving into the latest research on misinformation sharing across WhatsApp and Facebook with Dr. Patricia Rossini from the University of Liverpool before the 2020 fifth annual Social Media and Politics Year in Review. Yes, we are almost at the end of the year. Hang in there, y'all. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Malmö. See you next time.